In this video, I'm going to be addressing something called the rhetorical appeals. It will be important for you to become familiar with what these terms mean. You'll be using the rhetorical appeals in a number of your essays. You will be applying them as a writer, and you'll also have to be familiar with what they mean so that you can analyze the sources that you come across in your own research-based writing. But what are the rhetorical appeals? Before we can address what the rhetorical appeals are, let's take one step back from that and talk about the three elements of communication. Now, we've all heard that old sort of riddle, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? Now, of course, the point of this riddle is that, well, how would anyone know, right? If we weren't there, how would we know if it made this sound or not, right? Similar but very different from that. For an act of communication to occur, obviously you need someone to be speaking or writing down some kind of message. And much like that tree in the woods, or unlike that tree in the woods, I guess I should say, that writer or speaker needs an audience to receive that message, right? You have to deliver this message to the audience. You can't communicate unless you've got one person speaking or delivering and another person receiving. Furthermore, you obviously need some kind of subject matter, right? Otherwise, we can't just constitute making noise, just sending random blather from writer or speaker to an audience member. That doesn't act as, can't stand as a form of communication. We need a specific subject matter to be communicated to the audience. Now, these three elements of communication are constantly in communication with each other, or affect one another, I should say, right? Let me give you a hypothetical to illustrate my point here. Let's put you in the place of the writer or speaker here, and of course here I have you depicted as a blank Facebook profile image. My apologies there. What a great offense. I know we must immediately get in there and personalize our profiles. But in any case, I'm going to put you in there as the speaker or writer. And let's say that you've recently returned from a great spring break vacation. Okay? You went away to some great beach somewhere, some other beach besides Daytona Beach. You've been there plenty of times, obviously. Went with a group of friends, had a good time for a week or so. You've just gotten home. You are a little sunburned, a little worse for wear, but again, anxious to talk to some people about what just happened in the past few days. So you pick up your phone and you make a few phone calls, right? Now, your subject, obviously spring break, you're going to make some phone calls, and let's say you make 3 phone calls this day. You've got 3 different audiences. You call those friends who unfortunately couldn't go along with you on this trip. They just didn't have the cash, and they're anxiously awaiting to hear, what happened, what they missed out on, begrudgingly so. You also called your parents, okay? They've been waiting for this call. They thought you were going to call while you were on spring break, but they didn't get that message, so they're kind of anxious to hear what you have to say. And you also decide to give your dear old grandma a call as well. Okay, so in each of these conversations, the subject remains the same. You're talking about your spring break vacation. But we have here 3 different audiences. Now, you're a busy person. So, if I were to step in and say, hey, look, I know you're a busy person. Why don't I save you some time? I'm just going to record your first phone conversation with your friends, and then I'm just going to go ahead and send that same exact conversation off to your parents and your grandma. Now, would you be okay with that? Some of you might be thinking, yeah, sure, why not? I don't care. I talk the same way around my family as I do my friends. Whatever. Some of you might be thinking, I don't know that I would want that exact same word-for-word conversation sent to these 3 audiences, right? How might these conversations differ? Well, they may differ in tone. You may use, let's say, more slang with your friends because they actually know what those words mean, whereas grandma might be a little confused, and even your parents, perhaps to some extent. You may also select some different content to include or not include. Okay, all of this stuff happened during your spring break, but when you talk to grandma, you may focus on that restaurant you went to and how good the food was. Or you might point out, how great the security was in your hotel, that you felt that safe and that you did get some good rest during your break as well. Right? Your parents kind of the same thing. You might focus on things like where you ate, how safe you were. You may, throw in how little money you actually spent on this vacation, thinking that that would make them happy, right? By contrast, you may not heavily censor yourself as much, obviously, when you talk to your friends. They would get all the sort of details, I'm sure. So, as you can see, who you're speaking to will often affect how you shape your subject matter, how you deliver it, your tone of voice, the emotional quality of it, and what you decide to put in or leave out of your delivery of that information. Now, a long, long time ago, back in ancient Greece, when people laid around in robes, eating grapes while reclining on furniture, or as it's been depicted in some painting or cartoon I've seen sometime over my lifetime, this fella Aristotle came to realize that these three elements of communication were constantly in flux with one another. And he came to understand that if he were to appeal to any one or all three of these sides of this triangle, that he could figure out how to be persuasive as a speaker or a writer if he made some appeals to the three sides of this triangle. So, in addition to the three elements of communication, we add some corresponding rhetorical appeals. With the speaker or writer, we have ethos. With the audience, we have pathos. And with the subject, we have logos. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Boy, those are odd words. They kind of sound like Greek to me, as they say. Well, in this case, you're not too far off, right? They are kind of foreign words, but it's important to understand what they mean because they have their own unique definition and concept behind them that we'll be applying again in many of your papers this semester. They might be kind of funny and hard to kind of get a handle on, and I know they sound odd. They kind of sound, ethos, pathos, logos. Kind of sounds like the Three Musketeers here, right? Well, if that visual sort of helps you remember the words themselves, whatever works for you, right? But let's actually break down what do these words mean. I think what's critical here to bear in mind is that each of these appeals is an appeal to one of those sides of the triangle, right? So ethos is connected to the writer or speaker themselves, okay? Yes, it's kind of a weird looking word, but go looking for other words that look like the word ethos, right? Think of words like ethical. To have ethos as a writer or speaker means that you are ethical. It also sort of means that you are somewhat of an expert on your topic. Now, something to bear in mind, ethos, you want to think an ethical person, an expert on their topic, but something to keep in mind as you're writing your essays and trying to use and apply ethos, or particularly when you're reading other sources and trying to consider whether or not you feel the writer has ethos on this topic. I want you to remember that credentials alone do not guarantee credibility. Think about some of the most prestigious people in our society that you might think, well, those folks there, they're trustworthy. They've gone and got a lot of education. They're a doctor, they're a lawyer, right? Doctors, for example, go to school for a long time. They have a lot of knowledge on how to heal us, right? So one might think, oh, lots of credentials, so I can trust this person, Think of those commercials. Trust me, I'm a doctor, right? Or in any case, we've also heard the expression, well, I'd like a second opinion, right? And why is that? Well, if you go to a doctor and he suggests that you get some kind of procedure done, and you think to yourself, gee, that sounds kind of risky or uncomfortable. I don't think I want to go to those extremes. Is that really necessary, or are you getting some kind of commission for cutting me open, right? This is where that expression comes from. Yes, this person's a doctor. Yes, they have a lot of information and the ultimate in credentials, but that alone doesn't always guarantee that we feel that we can trust them, they have our best interests in mind, or that someone else out there might have a better idea. And that's why we turn to some other doctor. But enough with these examples. What does ethos mean? Ethos is an appeal to the credibility and trustworthiness of the writer or speaker. The credibility and trustworthiness. So how can a writer demonstrate that he or she has ethos? Be fair and balanced. Acknowledge the views of others. If there's a viewpoint out there that is different than your own, either a completely contrary point, or perhaps if you are offering up a proposal and someone has a slightly different viewpoint on how to solve this problem, you can't ignore these opposing or differing views. Odds are, if your readers are intelligent, they too have come across it. And if you ignore these differing views in your writing, your readers will be left with only two conclusions to make. Either you don't have the expertise because you seem to be completely unaware of these different viewpoints, therefore they can't trust you, or they may come to the conclusion that you are purposely trying to pull the wool over their eyes by pretending like this other viewpoint doesn't exist. In either case, it will damage your ethos. You want to be fair and balanced. You want to acknowledge that not everyone thinks the way you do. And when you do this in your writing, it fosters that trustworthiness, that credibility. I know someone else doesn't think the way I do. I still think the way I do despite this. Let me explain to you why. When using sources, also be sure to attribute them. Give credit where credit is due. Use signal phrases and quotation marks around exact wording. This is probably one of the easiest ways of picking out ethos in someone's writing. You can't be trustworthy if you're taking credit for someone else's work without acknowledging it. Cite your expertise and first-hand experience whenever it is relevant. You may have some kind of expertise in this topic that you're talking about, whether it's some kind of hobby or whatever it may be. You may have lived through something that gives you that specific expertise. For example, a doctor may begin his or her speech with a statement such as, I have practiced medicine for 30 years, and ... right? So right there is a direct statement in which the speaker is informing you, hey, I have this expertise. It's time to listen. I know what I'm talking about. By contrast, writers and speakers, they don't always come right out and make those direct statements. Sometimes it can come off sounding a little pompous, but that doesn't mean that we can't assess whether or not they are credible or trustworthy. Look at their document. Are they referencing other points of views? Google them. Do they have the necessary expertise? So again, sometimes it is directly stated, sometimes we have to do a little bit of our own digging. Next up, we have pathos. Now, pathos is associated with the audience corner of the rhetorical triangle. Pathos, again, may be a weird sounding word. Think about maybe the word empathy. And here I want to distinguish between, let's say, the word empathy and sympathy in order to help understand really what pathos truly means. Now, when we sympathize with someone, perhaps we've found out that a friend of ours has lost a close family member. Now, if we've never experienced a similar form of loss, we may be able to sympathize with that person. We can acknowledge, yeah, I'm sure that doesn't feel very good. I haven't lived it myself, but I understand you're hurting. Empathy, by contrast, if you can empathize with somebody, it means, yeah, I've been there. I kind of know where you're coming from. As Bill Clinton once famously said, I feel your pain, right? So when you think of pathos, think of that word empathy, because that's what it means when a writer reaches out to their audience and makes some kind of emotional, basically human connection with their audience. Pathos means an appeal to the audience's emotions, values, and commonly held beliefs. And you may notice I put the word commonly in quotation marks there, because this would depend on exactly who you're addressing, who your audience is. Commonly held beliefs are not always uniformly held amongst all members of society. I'll address that in a little more detail in just a second here. But again, as you might get confused with these appeals, remember that they coincide with one side of the rhetorical triangle. Pathos coincides with your audience. How can a writer use pathos to appeal to his or her audience? Well, you may tug on their heartstrings, play on their emotions. We've all seen those ads where some sad music is playing, and you may see a child, perhaps, in a third world country who looks to be emaciated, and a gentleman walks up behind him and says, for pennies a day, or for the price of a cup of coffee per day, you could make a big change in this child's life. Obviously, this ad is targeting our emotions, making us feel perhaps a little guilty that we have so much and this child has so little. It is targeting any grown-ups, feelings of need to care for a child. So it's tugging on those heartstrings, playing on their emotions, their various emotions. You can also appeal to your audience their morals, their values, their beliefs. What is right? What is wrong? These values, these beliefs, these commonly held beliefs may be political, spiritual, or civil, right? When appropriate, one may reference their own faith and what they believe in order to help further their position. Sometimes, perhaps depending on the audience, that isn't appropriate. But when we look at these three, morals, values, and beliefs, commonly held beliefs or civil beliefs perhaps, these may not necessarily be right or wrong or faith-based. One might even play upon their audience's sense of patriotism. Is this in the country's best interest or not? Or even something more kind of everyday, commonsensical, like a sense of fair play. This isn't really fair. We all know from a very early age, we're all told in school we have to play fair, we have to, share various items on the playground or whatever. We need to carry that on throughout our lives, right? Everyone knows what fair play is, right? In any case, pathos has to do with a writer reaching out to their audience and building some kind of rapport with them, citing some kind of commonalities between their own life and the life of the audience member, demonstrating I'm not just words on a page, but I'm a human being. I've had experiences much like yourself. Now, one big danger, of course, with pathos. Know your audience, as I was saying a second ago. You have to know your audience before you attempt to appeal to them. Consider, do you have what might be considered a mixed audience or a uniform audience? In a uniform audience, it's kind of like that expression, preaching to the choir. everyone in that audience, they're already probably on board with your position, your platform. A mixed audience, by contrast, that's not the case. You're addressing a whole body of individuals, and they may have different spiritual beliefs, they may have different viewpoints on various hot button issues, and so if you want to present your position to them, you have to be a little more careful about your use of, again, quote unquote, commonly held beliefs. Think about, we've recently had a new presidential election. Think about the speeches that are made at the Democratic or Republican national conventions. Often you'll hear that phrase, appealing to one's base, right? When a pundit, or I'm sorry, when a candidate addresses their own party, they speak in much different terms. They speak in different terms than they may when they've received the nomination and now they're running against the other party in the national election, right? So think about that. Pathos can be very powerful, but can also backfire if you inadvertently offend any of your audience members. Finally, we have logos, which coincides with the subject matter. Okay? When you hear the word or see the word logos, think logic, because logos means an appeal to logic and reasoning. How can a writer demonstrate logos in his or her writing? Reference facts, common knowledge, and secondary sources. Take note of the rhetorical triangle, how we would have the speaker here, the audience here, and the subject matter in between the speaker and the audience. Logos is a whole pool of information that a writer can reference, second-hand information, research that has been done. The writer is saying, here is some information that supports what I have to say. I didn't come up with it. These are other people's ideas. The fact that they exist corroborates my viewpoint. And if you have any question with this source material, it's not mine. It's somewhere in between the writer and the audience. It's someone else's. Go check it out. You go check it out, right? You don't trust me? Read it for yourself. What do you think? You want to not only present this information to show that you are intelligent and well researched, but you also need to step your readers through your reasoning. And we discussed this in class previously as well. When we talk about argument in this almost mathematical formula of claim plus supporting details, those secondary sources, facts, figures, common knowledge, but that oh so important reasoning where you step your readers through how it all adds up, what you take away from that information, how it informs your viewpoint. The more clear this is, the more clear your reasoning is to your readers, the more logical it sounds, and the easier time they have sort of nodding their head and saying, yeah, you're making sense. I see where you're coming from. And you can use this framework not only for creating and producing your own viewpoint, but also to counter those opposing views that you come across. I've mentioned previously when discussing ethos that you demonstrate you're credible and trustworthy by acknowledging these opposing views, but a handy way of countering these views is through this sort of framework, a logical pursuit, rather than just saying, well, that person's an idiot, don't trust them, right? What you want to do is break down the opposing view's position much like this same kind of mathematical formula. Well, so-and-so is making this claim, these are the supporting details they use, and I find their reasoning a bit faulty. Let me explain why. Instead of sounding like a emotionally charged, erratic individual, if you use logos to counter these views, you will seem very fair and balanced, logical, and trustworthy. So this all goes to show that these appeals are not mutually exclusive. They all exist on the ends of this same triangle, and yes, there is a lot of overlap. If you use a lot of logos, for example, you are very logical, you reference a lot of source material, well then of course that is going to establish a sense of trustworthiness for your readers, make you seem like you know what you're talking about, like you were an expert. So yes, these terms do overlap. It can kind of get a little confusing, I understand. As far as the application of these terms, again, bear in mind where they exist on this triangle. Ethos, when you're talking about ethos, you're always talking about the speaker or the writer, the speaker or writer's trustworthiness, their credibility. When we're talking about pathos, we're talking about a writer or speaker reaching out to their audience with some kind of emotional appeal or in some efforts of building a human rapport with them. When we're talking about logos, we're talking about something outside of either the speaker or the audience, but rather this information, facts and figures, and putting it together in a logical way so that it's easy for the audience to take in. So those are the rhetorical appeals. I hope you found this video helpful. Of course, if you ever have any further questions about it, please chat with me or send me an email.